What if everything you're hearing about this ceasefire isn't the full picture? What if what looks like peace is actually something more complicated? Something shaped by strategy, timing, and perception rather than a clear resolution. Now, before we go further, let's be clear. This video is not claiming that the war is continuing in a hidden or secret way. Instead, this is an analytical discussion, a way of exploring how ceasefires in history and geopolitics don't always mean a complete end to conflict. Because in international relations, a ceasefire can mean many things. A pause, a negotiation window, or sometimes a moment for both sides to reassess their position. So today, we're going to break this down using a framework of game theory, historical patterns, and strategic behavior to understand one key question. Does a ceasefire always mean the conflict is truly over? Recently, there's been a lot of excitement. People are saying the war is over, a deal is being discussed, negotiations are happening, maybe this is the end. And that optimism is understandable. But if we look at similar situations in history, we often see something different. In many cases, ceasefires are not final outcomes. They are intermediate stages in a much longer process. Sometimes they lead to peace. Other times, they simply delay further tension. So instead of asking, is this peace? A more useful question might be, what has actually changed on the ground? Because in geopolitics, what is announced publicly and what is happening strategically are not always the same thing. For example, we're seeing when a ceasefire is announced, we should look at multiple signals. Are military movements slowing down or continuing? Are negotiations producing concrete agreements or just frameworks? Are all parties aligned or do they have different interpretations? These are the details that determine whether a ceasefire is stable or temporary. Now, let's talk about something important. In any negotiation, the structure of the proposed terms tells you a lot about how realistic the agreement actually is. If one side presents a set of demands that are extremely difficult for the other side to accept fully, then those demands may not be a final deal, but rather a starting position for negotiation. This is common in diplomacy. Countries often begin with maximum demands, not because they expect all of them to be accepted, but because it gives them room to negotiate. So when we hear about large, comprehensive proposals, the key question is not, will this be accepted exactly as it is? But rather, how much of this can realistically be agreed upon? And that brings us to a deeper idea. Sometimes what looks like a disagreement is actually part of the negotiation process itself. At the same time, observers also pay attention to real-world actions. Because if diplomatic talks are happening, but military positioning continues, analysts may interpret that in different ways. Some see it as precaution, others see it as leverage in negotiations. Both interpretations exist in serious policy discussions. This doesn't automatically mean deception, but it does mean the situation is more complex than a simple war versus peace narrative. And that's the key theme of this video. Not everything is black and white. Not everything is final, just because it is announced. So instead of jumping to conclusions, we're going to go deeper. In the next part, we'll explore how military structure, strategy, and decentralized systems can affect whether a ceasefire is even possible to fully implement in practice. Because sometimes, even if leaders agree to pause, the system itself makes stopping much harder than it seems. To understand why some ceasefires struggle to hold, we need to look beyond announcements and focus on structure. In many modern conflicts, warfare is not always controlled by a single centralized command in a simple way. Instead, it can involve multiple layers of coordination, regional actors, and decentralized decision-making systems. In strategic studies, analysts often discuss how different military structures affect the ability to pause or stop a conflict. A highly centralized system can, in theory, respond quickly to political decisions. But in more distributed or layered systems, implementation becomes more complicated. Orders may take time to translate into action on the ground, and different units may interpret risk and timing differently. This is where the idea of strategic autonomy comes in. In some cases, regional commanders or allied groups operate with a degree of independence, especially in high-pressure environments. That doesn't mean they are acting outside the system, but it does mean that coordination during a ceasefire becomes more complex than a single announcement can capture. Because of this, even when political leaders signal de-escalation, the actual situation on the ground may take time to reflect that shift. Analysts often point out that ceasefires are not events, they are processes. They require communication, trust, and alignment across multiple actors, all of which take time to build. Another important factor is perception. In conflict situations, both sides are constantly evaluating each other's intentions. If one side believes the other is using a pause to gain strategic advantage, they may remain cautious or continue defensive preparations. This does not necessarily mean escalation is certain, but it does highlight how trust plays a central role in whether a ceasefire holds. From a game theory perspective, this can be understood as a coordination problem. Each side must decide whether to fully commit to de-escalation or maintain readiness in case the other side does not follow through. When uncertainty is high, both sides may choose to remain prepared, even during negotiations. This creates a situation where diplomacy and strategy are happening at the same time. Publicly, there may be discussions about peace and long-term solutions. At the same time, behind the scenes, each side is ensuring that it does not lose its strategic position. Historical patterns support this view. Many conflicts have gone through multiple ceasefires before reaching a lasting resolution. Some of these pauses led to meaningful agreements. Others broke down due to disagreements, misunderstandings, or changing conditions on the ground. It is also important to consider that ceasefires often involve more than two actors. Regional dynamics, alliances, and external stakeholders can all influence how a situation evolves. When multiple parties are involved, aligning expectations becomes even more difficult. So when we analyze a ceasefire, the key question is not simply whether an agreement exists, but whether the underlying conditions support that agreement. Are incentives aligned? Is there enough trust? Are all relevant actors included in the framework? If the answer to these questions is unclear, then analysts tend to describe the situation as fragile rather than resolved. This does not mean that peace is impossible. It simply means that reaching a stable outcome requires more than a single announcement. It requires sustained effort, consistent communication, and gradual confidence building between all sides involved. In the next part, we will connect this analysis to the broader picture, including economic signals, global reactions, and how narratives shape public understanding of conflict situations. To fully understand the significance of a ceasefire, we also have to look at its global impact, especially on economics and public perception. In today's interconnected world, geopolitical events don't stay confined to one region. They influence energy markets, supply chains, investor sentiment, and overall economic stability. When a ceasefire is announced, markets often respond immediately. Oil prices may stabilize, stock markets may react positively, and there is a general sense of relief. This reaction is not necessarily based on long-term certainty, but on short-term expectations that tensions might decrease. However, analysts often point out that markets respond to signals, not just outcomes. A ceasefire announcement sends a signal of possible stability, even if the underlying situation has not fully changed. That is why, in some cases, initial optimism can be followed by renewed uncertainty if deeper issues remain unresolved. This brings us to the concept of narrative. In geopolitics, narratives play a powerful role in shaping how events are understood by the public. Governments, media, and institutions all contribute to framing situations in ways that are easier to communicate and interpret. A ceasefire, as a concept, naturally fits into a narrative of de-escalation and progress. It suggests movement toward peace, and in many cases, that is a genuine and positive step. But from an analytical perspective, it is still important to separate the narrative from the structural reality. The structural reality includes factors like strategic interests, long-term objectives, and the balance of power. These are slower-moving elements that do not change overnight. Even when dialogue begins, these deeper dynamics continue to shape decisions on both sides. From a broader perspective, this is why many experts approach such situations with cautious optimism. They recognize the value value of diplomatic engagement, while also acknowledging the complexity of achieving a lasting resolution. Another key factor is time. In many historical cases, conflicts have not ended suddenly, but have evolved through phases. Periods of tension, negotiation, partial agreements, and gradual stabilization. A ceasefire can be one of those phases, but it is rarely the final step on its own. So the question is not whether the ceasefire is real or fake. That kind of binary thinking often oversimplifies a much more complex situation. A more useful way to think about it is this. A ceasefire is a moment within a larger process. It can succeed, it can fail, or it can transform into something else depending on how the underlying issues are addressed over time. What matters most is whether the conditions that led to conflict in the first place are being resolved, reduced, or simply postponed. This is where critical thinking becomes essential. Instead of reacting only to headlines, it is important to look at patterns, incentives, and long-term trends. To ask not just what is being said, but what is changing in reality. Because in global politics, outcomes are rarely determined by a single event. They are shaped by a combination of decisions, pressures, and evolving circumstances over time. So as discussions continue and new developments emerge, the most important thing is not to assume a final conclusion too early. The situation is still developing. The outcomes are still uncertain. And the path forward will depend on how effectively all sides can move from temporary pauses towards sustainable solutions. That is the framework, not a prediction, not a claim of certainty, but a way to understand complexity. And in a world where information moves fast and narratives form quickly, taking the time to analyze deeply is more important than ever.